Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm going to pick up where I left off with if you changed your name at Ellis Island today. Last time we read about what happens when people arrived at Ellis Island, how they were inspected by doctors, inspected by lawyers, asked a lot of questions. So today we're going to see some of the other things that they had to do when they got to Ellis Island. Did you have to have any money when you arrived? The United States immigration law said that a person could not come into the country if he or she would become a public charge. That meant the government did not want to have to pay money to house, clothe, or feed people. And so the Commissioner of Immigration made a rule that everyone entering the country had to have $10 and money for railroad tickets. Later, the amount was raised to $25. $25 is a lot of money for many immigrants. People often had to work months to save that much money. Immigrant aid groups in America challenged the rule in a court case and won. But even though the rule was dropped, many inspectors continued to use it. Immigrants often helped one another. After they passed inspection, they would secretly hand money down the line to the person behind them. Others were helped by ship's officers. Since the steamship companies had to pay your return trip if you were not admitted to America, some ship officers lent immigrants money until they had passed through inspection. But as soon as they passed, the immigrants had to pay it back. If you didn't have enough money with you, you were often detained for days until a friend or relative sent you the money at Ellis Island. There's an illustration of people going through that inspection and passing the money between each other. Did you have to have a job waiting for you? No. And if you did, you could be in trouble. You might be sent back to your old homeland. In 1885, the U.S. Congress passed a law that said employers could not make contracts or agreements with immigrants to bring them to America, promising them jobs. Congress was afraid that immigrants would accept lower wages than American workers and take jobs away from those already living here. This presented a real problem for immigrants. On one hand, they couldn't have a job waiting for them. On the other hand, they had to show that they were able and willing to work and wouldn't have a problem getting a job. And if you couldn't support yourself, you could become a public charge. Then the government could send you back to your old country. Did you have to be able to read and write in English? Most of the immigrants who came through Ellis Island were not asked if they could read at all. Then in 1917, Congress passed a law saying anyone over the age of 16 had to be able to read. You didn't have to read English, you just had to be able to read some language. Those who supported the law didn't want so many people coming to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. Some thought that these immigrants were inferior or not as good as people who came from England, Germany, and Scandinavia. Others were afraid that Americans would lose jobs to the immigrants because the newcomers would be so willing to work for less money. By making immigrants pass a literacy test, they hoped to keep many people out. Once the literacy law was passed, immigration inspectors had cards printed in different languages: Hindu, Persian, Romanian, Hebrew, German, Russian, Greek, Armenian, Turkish, Polish, Swedish, Italian, and so many more. Each card had a 40-word passage that the immigrant had to read. One young Armenian girl was very afraid that her mother would be deported because she couldn't read. But the woman was very lucky. The inspector who examined her was a kind man. Perhaps he believed that she would make a good citizen even though she couldn't read. He knew she was religious and could recite a prayer, so he handed her a page that had that prayer printed in Armenian and told her to read it. She then read it and passed. What happens if you were detained or held back? If you were detained because you were sick, you'd be put in the hospital and treated until you were better. If your disease was incurable or contagious, you were deported. Trachoma, that contagious eye disease that led to blindness, was the most common medical condition that people were deported for. You would also be deported if the inspectors thought you had committed crimes in your old country, had come to America with the promise of a job, wouldn't be able to support yourself or your family, or had certain mental or physical problems that would keep you from being able to work. Then you would get a chalk mark, SI, or a tag that meant special inquiry. You'd wait until 3 inspectors with an interpreter could hear your case. It was like a court of law, but you weren't allowed to have a lawyer speak for you. If this board of special inquiry ruled against you, you could appeal all the way to the officials in charge of immigration in Washington, D.C. About 20 of every 100 immigrants went before a board of special inquiry, but only about 2 of every 100 were actually deported. That sounds like a low number, but in some years, thousands of immigrants were coming every day. That means more than 1,000 would be turned away every month. How long would you stay at Ellis Island? Most people were questioned, examined, and ready to leave the island in 3 to 5 hours. Some had to stay much longer. Lillian Case and her brother both came down with the measles, and their mother caught pneumonia. They were kept in separate wards of the hospital. 3 weeks passed before they were well enough to leave the island. If you didn't have much money with you, you needed a sponsor, a person who said they'd be responsible for supporting you until you found work. Sometimes you would be detained until the sponsor or the necessary money arrived. Some people were denied entry and had to go back to their old homes. Families then had to make a painful decision. Should everyone return, or should the family break up? Any child who was sent back had to be accompanied by an adult. It's a tough thing to decide, isn't it? What would you eat at Ellis Island? If you were detained or arrived at night and couldn't be processed until the next day, you were served meals at the Ellis Island restaurant. There were 2 kitchens, 1 regular and 1 kosher for religious Jewish people. In the dining room, you sat at long wooden tables, just like this illustration. For breakfast, you might be served eggs, bread, butter, milk, or coffee. A typical dinner or supper included soup, beef stew, vegetables, potatoes, pudding, coffee, milk, and sometimes a piece of fruit. Some of the food was strange and different for immigrants. One young girl remembered the first time she ate a banana. She had never seen one before, and neither had any of the people she was with. One person ate the banana, skin and all, before they were told to peel it. An 11-year-old boy remembered that every night they gave us 2 or 3 cookies, fig bars, and a glass of milk. I never tasted that before in my life. They were so good. The steamship company that brought you to America paid for your food and care while you were on Ellis Island. But if you were traveling farther than New York City, you had to pay for your own box lunch. Where would you sleep? If you stayed overnight at Ellis Island, you'd sleep either in the hospital or in a dormitory. During the years of the greatest migration to America, both were usually overcrowded. In the dorms, there were long rows of triple-decker bunks separated by narrow aisles. Men and women slept in separate areas. Children were usually with their mothers. I'm going to stop there for today. I'll see you next time as we continue If Your Name Was Changed at Ellis Island.